From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Jason Steinhauer, and I'm a program specialist at the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. On behalf of the Kluge Center, welcome to the library. Before we begin today's program, please take a moment to check your cell phones and other electronic devices, and please ensure they are set to silent. I'll also take a moment to let you know that this program is being filmed for placement on the Kluge Center's website and on the Library of Congress website. Today's lecture is presented by the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress in conjunction with the National History Center and the International Seminar on Decolonization. Now in its 10th and final year, the Decolonization Seminar brings 15 young scholars from around the world to Washington, D.C. for 4 weeks of research and discussion into the dissolution of colonial empires in the period after the Second World War and the emergence of new nations, particularly in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. In 10 years, the seminar has brought 150 emerging scholars from the Americas, Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and Africa to the library to use the library's extraordinary global collections in 470 different languages, as well as other resources in Washington for this research. The transition from colonial empires to nation states is an extraordinary and momentous period in our global story, one that is largely responsible for the map of the world that we recognize and study today. The seminar has helped solidify decolonization as a distinct and emerging field within the history profession, and the Kluge Center and the Library of Congress are delighted that our collections have informed this scholarship. Funding for this seminar is generously provided by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the seminar is organized and administered by the National History Center, whose mission is to reinforce the critical role that history and historical knowledge play in public decision-making and civic life. I encourage you to visit the National History Center website to learn more about their important work. The successful collaboration for the past 10 years is a testament to the vision of the Kluge Center's founding director, Dr. Prosser Gifford, our recently retired director, Dr. Carolyn Brown, and Professor William Roger Lewis, a distinguished scholar of British history and the British Empire, a member of the Library of Congress Scholars Council, conceiver of the International Seminar on Decolonization, and a director of the seminar since 2006. To him, we extend our sincere thanks. A word about the Kluge Center. The Kluge Center is a vibrant scholar center on Capitol Hill that brings together scholars and researchers from around the world to stimulate and energize one another, to distill wisdom from the library's rich resources, and to interact with policymakers and the public. The center offers opportunities for senior scholars and postdoctoral fellows, as well as PhD candidates, to do research in the Library of Congress collections. We also offer free public lectures, conferences, symposia, and other programs, and we administer the Kluge Prize, which recognizes lifetime achievement in the fields of the humanities and social sciences. For more information about the Kluge Center, I invite you to sign up for our RSS feed on the way out. This RSS email will let you know about future programs and also fellowship opportunities for you to conduct your own research here at the Library of Congress. So now it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Dane Kennedy to the podium. Dane is the Elmer Lewis Kaiser Professor of History and International Affairs at the George Washington University, which is my alma mater. And he is a member of this year's Decolonization Seminar faculty. And Dane will introduce today's speaker.
Thank you all for coming. It's a kind of bittersweet pleasure to be up here and to be introducing our speaker today, simply because this is the last seminar that we will have. Fortunately, it's a terrific group of 15 scholars, and we're in our second week. And as we've done throughout the 10 years of the seminar, we have also had 2 public lectures to accompany the seminar. And we're going out with a bang with two really superb speakers. Next week will be Professor Jordana Belkin from the University of Washington. But today I want to introduce, it really gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Todd Shepard, whose innovative work on the history of France and French decolonization has really become essential reading for anyone who works on the history of decolonization. Professor Todd is a associate professor of history and co-director of the program for the study of women, gender, and sexuality at Johns Hopkins University. He wrote a seminal first book titled The Invention of Decolonization, the Algerian War and the Remaking of France, which probably did as much work as any in the last decade or two to force us to rethink the meaning and consequences of decolonization, especially in the context of French sovereignty. He's also written a series of very important essays. His work has long been essential reading for the seminar reading list. He has a new book coming out next year titled France, Sex, and Arab Men, 1962 to 1979. And today he's going to speak on a topic that is drawn from that book. So please welcome Professor Shepard.
Thank you so much. Thank you especially to Professor Kennedy, to Professor Lewis, Professor Levine, and the members of the seminar. It's great to be here. On the way over, I thought of something which I should warn you about. This is going to be a real PG lecture. There's not very much sex in it, but I will continue on. And this is from my kind of forthcoming book. I'm waiting for readers' reports, but it will come out in French first in the fall of 2016. And I'm playing with other titles, so I'm going to give you a new potential title. Algerian Questions and Answers Made the Sexual Revolution French. This is the arguments of what I'm now calling the erotics of Algerian difference, the Arab man, and sexual revolution in France, 1962 to 1979. Which is a history of how and why from the disappearance of French Algeria in 1962 through the 1970s. And there's a reason why it ends in 79, and I'm not going to talk about that today. Highly sexualized claims about Arabs, and I'm going to put this in quotation marks, and again, we could talk about that, but I'm not going to talk about it today, were omnipresent in important public French discussions, both those that dealt with sex and those that spoke of Arabs. It explores, to simplify, how the so-called sexual revolution, which covered roughly those years, the 1960s to the 1970s, took shape in a France profoundly influenced by the ongoing effects of the Algerian War, of the Algerian Revolution, which of course took place between 1954 and 1962. To understand each, it is necessary to analyze them together, constructing a frame that also renders visible some of the ways in which the fight for sexual liberation, usually explained as a US and European invention, also developed out of the worldwide anti-colonial movement of the mid-20th century. And it's particularly this aspect of the book's argument that I'll be focusing on today. So I'll kind of lead you some of the big points about it and how that relates to this claim of the shaping of the sexual revolution by anti-colonialism, and then focus on what will be is the book's last chapter about discussions and debates about rape. Rape as metaphor and rape as act over the course of the 1970s. In general, French discussions about sex in the 1970s can be fruitfully mapped onto a chronology of crises and evolutions that closely paralleled that of other national debates, the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany. Okay, it's going to looks in many ways quite closely similar. Yet I suggest what made them particular, what made them French, rather than more generally Western or late modern, were the central roles that invocations of Arab men, and particularly Algeria, played in these debates, which altered their contours and at key moments, their contents. This French history, that is, also foregrounds what previous, usually celebratory accounts of the sexual revolution have obscured. The dramatic increase in discussions about sex, of public claims that sex should be treasured and liberated, the increase in the availability of contraceptives and other technologies that made it easier to pursue sexual pleasure, the decline in the persecution or prosecution of sexually heterodox acts or individuals, and subsequently a liberalization of regulations, all of these were part of a tense and complicated development, rather than a simple process in which desirable freedoms, too long repressed, simply exploded outwards. The ongoing admixture of anti-colonialism and racism in the sexual history I explore reveals some of the ways the terrain was more perilous than usually thought, while also mapping how reactionary or conservative critics, critiques, activists, questions, some retrofitted, some quite innovative, were part of the sexual revolution, rather than simply outside of it or reacting to it, coming afterwards. After Algerian independence, what I termed the erotics of Algerian difference proved useful to deeply political efforts to grapple with wide-ranging uncertainties about the post-decolonization boundaries of the French nation, the French state. This happened in large part because of choices and arguments made by anti-colonial activists. And this is a point that I think distinguishes what I'm calling the erotics of Algerian difference from the deeper phenomena of so-called sexual orientalism, on which it draws. So, of course, from Edward Said's own work, a couple other texts that have used this discussion. So I think there's some here. I'm going to pay particular attention a little bit today. I think you'll see this to what I'm calling Maghrebi perspectives. But here I want to go into a little bit, Will, in a little bit about the real important role that anti-colonial nationalists, Algerians in particular, played in this discussion. Okay? It was visible over the course of the 1960s and 1970s. The crucial terrain was immigration, and the most important focus of claims and disagreements in France was the erotic relationship of France and the French to Algerian men. To misuse Freudian terms, all engaged in these debates in the unspoken question of whether the libidinal links between Algerian men and the French and France were to be repressed through demonization or cathected, made into something meaningful through emulation or objectification. The Algerian Revolution, which began on November 1, 1954, produced the context for this French history. In 1962, with independence, the fact of Algerian independence redefined legal bonds, ended French sovereignty, and concurrent claims that Algeria was a purely French, purely domestic affair. It affirmed that on the international stage, the two were now distinct entities, two states, two wholly different peoples. Formal decolonization also cast into doubt long-standing and explicitly sexualized explanations of why the French had to dominate and control Algeria. Ideas of Algerians as brutes, of Islam as an all-consuming and stultifying religion, the abasement of Muslim women, the result at once of obsession and frustration, signaled by the veil and the harem. The victory that Algerian nationalists won against the French Republic seemingly gave the lie to arguments that an overarching absence of sexual morality and self-control made the very possibility of civilization or modernity necessarily a gift from outside, that could come from outside and benefit Algerians. The fact of Algeria's decolonization, however, was not the primary reason the war, the struggle for independence, so affected what became the French sexual revolution. To understand the intensity with which, on the one hand, the effects of the Algerian Revolution, and on the other, militants' invocations of this event, framed French political arguments that invoked sex in the 1960s and 1970s, its victorious endpoint must, of course, be taken into account. Yet it was aspects, certain key aspects of the fight for Algerian independence that had greater effects. Post-1945 anti-colonial struggles more generally, but Algeria's particularly, substantively shaped what became known as the sexual revolution. During the struggle for independence, anti-imperialist writers and Algerian nationalist propagandists forced attention to and redefined the erotics of empire. In the first scientific study, it was announced as such, it was published in parts in Les Temps Modernes, published in the name of the FLN. It was supposed to give some accurate evidence-based argument to their larger claims. The resistance of the Algerian family to colonialist alienation, which came out in 1961, for example, by far the largest chapter and the central chapter was entitled simply Prostitution. Its authors insistently presented prostitution as a metaphor, which revealed how French colonialism worked to devirilize Algerian men through the commodification of Algerian women. Such tactics and arguments upset long-standing certainties and undercut French efforts to deploy them. While this dynamic can be identified in diverse struggles over colonialism in the mid-20th century, the Algerian Revolution rendered it strikingly visible. Anti-imperialist critics directly targeted long-standing Orientalist, racist, colonialist claims about how sex and gender were and needed to be, should be, organized. These claims had historically worked either to assert essential differences between East and West, with the latter as better because more modern, more humane, or to comfort the idea that Western institutions, mores, and values, notably around the celebration of correctly organized heterosexual relations, monogamous heterosexual relations between two equal individuals, men and women, equal in certain domains at least, as universal and open to all. Now, in some ways, so they challenged both of these. In some ways, the analyses of sex and gender that anti-colonialists proposed were not particularly radical. Certainly not when compared to post-1968 sexual revolutionaries in France or elsewhere. They accepted, these critics, that how sexuality and gender were organized, should be organized, how they were represented, what they meant to everybody, all did, as French mainstream thinking thought too, all did involve questions of self-control, of the necessary respect for gender differences. Men must be men, women must be women, of normality, modesty, of civilization. And they believed that deeply that sex was tied to this and gender norms were tied to this. Now, historians such as Beth Bailey and Dagmar Herzog have shown it was broad social and conceptual shifts, not isolated elite or avant-garde theorists focused on sex, trying to push the envelope on sexuality, that made the sexual revolution so massive, so striking to contemporaries. I mean, people immediately, constantly were talking about there is a sexual revolution, or they were calling for it. What made anti-colonialists so important was how they radically castigated pretensions that tied success and progress in the social organization of sex and gender, of normalcy, of modesty, of achieving civilization. They linked these efforts to discredited imperial projects, whether premised in the white man's burden or the civilizing mission. That is, they said, yes, these things should be achieved, but you are doing the opposite. Our struggle will bring normalcy. Our struggle will bring true men and true women. Our struggle will bring true relationships, heterosexuality, back to where it should be. In doing so, they revealed, that is, that the politics of domination, rather than the nature of human sexual relations, best explained imperialist claims about gender and sex, about what was wrong. And so the most well-known examples here, of course, involve the veil. So I have a couple images here, ways that there were discussions of women during the war, notably about veiling and unveiling. Here's a picture of Jamila Boupasha, who was raped, and as well as part of her larger suffering of torture at the hands of French soldiers because of her work with the National Liberation Front. But anti-colonial critics had particular success in destabling French certainties about masculinity and male sexuality, because we paid a lot of attention, and rightfully so, to questions about women at this moment, but more durably important within French discussions, because it seemed relatable, was what I'm going to call the heroic Algerian man. The veiled woman remained too foreign, even though a key point of discussion. In debates over torture, for example, the systematic torture that French forces used to try to extinguish Algerian national support, anti-colonial critics described how colonialism had rendered French men soft and perverted, suggesting that the painful humiliations, sadistic tortures inflicted on rebellious bodies revealed deviant desires in particular to possess their manliness. Revolutionary Algerian men, to the contrary, emerged in anti-imperialist depictions as the embodiment of healthy, virile, heterosexual masculinity. In The Gangrene, one of the most well-known exposés of torture, the book repeatedly returns to the unnatural lusts of the torturers, as opposed to the soft, homosexually shifty functionaries who seek to break them. The young Algerian men recounting their torture are valiant and virile. Moussa Kabaili is recognized by one of his tormentors as, quote, a veritable Don Juan, end quote. Just as some French radicals argued that the Algerian Revolution was the yeast which would raise a world revolution, so books such as The Gangrene, The Question by Henri Alleg, The Wretched of the Earth, by Frantz Fanon, proposed that valiant rebels could remind the French of what it really meant to be a man. And of course, the Battle of Algiers in particular, here's some images of Ali Lapointe, both in the film and in real life. I'm Ali Amar. And I particularly like this picture here, which it kind of shows, I think, some of the ways this imaginary of the male body, the Algerian hero, drew the attention of other men and tried to teach them how they should be men. Intra-French political debates during the Algerian War saw both troubling questions raised about French masculinity and, more unexpectedly, celebratory depictions of Algerian masculinity. European Frenchmen repeatedly tarred each other with Oriental vices, accusations of male sexual deviance that aimed to discredit political opponents. Take, for example, the summer 1958 cover story, The Paratrooper Attitude, described by a paratrooper, which appeared in L'Express. It was a weekly magazine, somewhat center-left, that had emerged as a forceful critic of the French military's repression in Algeria, notably its use of torture. Jacques Toulois begins by evoking, quote, the sacral fetishism and the fabulosity of, quote, the paratrooper's approach to his uniform, end quote. Then turns immediately to, quote, the similarity, which he reveals, he, the paratrooper, at every moment between the desire to control through the use of arms and to take control through sex, end quote. The author invokes his own experience to caution that, quote, the paratroopers aren't more homosexual than any other army. But what stands out is that this homosexuality is just below the surface at all times, end quote. One correspondent protested in a tone that captured, I think, the sense of Toulous's critique of the corps, of the paratroopers. Quote, I never met any homosexuals among the paratroopers. These guys are too male, too healthy for that kind of immorality, end quote. Now, this phenomena of back and forth, mutually accusing each other of what homosexuality is and who's got it, has been actually remarked by some of the most well-known historians of France. They've commented on the frequent appearance of homophobic slurs in domestic political debates during the Algerian War. Yet while scholars can no longer simply ignore such sex talk, these historians reduce its meaning to expressions of either, and they all do it, either anti-Semitism or anti-intellectualism. So for example, one description talks about how in 1955, Jean-Marie Le Pen, still around somewhat, quote, went to war against faggots, which apparently was another word for intellectuals, end quote. They fail, that is, to examine how the specifically colonial valence of these sexual innuendos and insults were emblematic of a new willingness among French commentators to deploy what we could call Orientalist tropes of unnatural masculinity to tar other French, notably French white men. Toulois, for example, claimed that, quote, the paratrooper found his true model in Arab lands, far more than on Vietnamese lands, because for Muslims, the meaning of relations with the other, big O, of the warrior's metaphysics, that of daily life, all of this is based on the meaning of homosexual relations, end quote. Because they dehistoricize the outpouring of anti-homosexual abuse, of invocations of homosexuality, with suggestions that such nastiness is simply to be expected from the far right. They always talk about this. They also miss how critics from all sides joined in, left as well as right, pro-independence as well as anti-independence. Anti-colonial struggle, that is, engaged issues of sex and gender that would be at the heart of the so-called sexual revolution. In a set of key wartime debates about Algerian and French men and women and their bodies, anti-colonial critics countered gendered and sexualized Orientalist presumptions. What they challenged was the claim that civilizing and modernizing colonialism could impose sexual normalcy. Yet, inadvertently, the links they made it newly possible to think that sexual norms more generally might be understood in reference to colonial oppression. French activists, sexual and gay liberationists, and feminists, most particularly, proved attentive and thankful students of these lessons. The questions anti-colonialists raised about the erotics of empire, that is, proved durably destabilizing and difficult to silence, and I'm going to focus here on how that worked in France. Besides arguments to try to respond to this set of Algerian anti-colonialist claims, French authorities also passed a series of laws to enforce sexual morality, which were quite atypical in the history of the French Republic. The constellation of measures imposed in 1960, for example, signals how intensely the war over whether Algerians were French upended foundational sexual and gender norms. In 1960, the French Parliament imposed a definition of social plagues that included prostitution, sexual trafficking, and homosexuality. That same year, 13 years after regulated bordellos had been banned in metropolitan France, that is on the European continent, the French overturned the last rules that still authorized the so-called regulationist approach to prostitution in France. Now, these rules had actually been voted right after the ban had been put in place. So this is in 1946, just a few weeks later. Okay? So they'd kept regulationism in place. They finally got rid of it. In 1960, France also became the last country in Western Europe to sign on to the United Nations 1946 treaty banning sexual trafficking. In his 1962 study of homosexuality, Edouard Roditi noted that the 1960 social plague law was the first time that the category or the word homosexuality had been, quote, spelled out in a French legislative text, end quote, which he directly linked to the Algerian War. So as people might know that the French Revolution eliminated almost all sexual crimes, in particular eliminated sodomy, as well as bestiality. And so these things never become, again, part of French law. But in the post between 1942 under Vichy, 1945 and 6 under de Gaulle, then again in the early 1960s, there's a new series of laws that begin to target what we could call homosexuality. Here in 1960, then the law names it homosexuality. Okay? He first paralleled this legislative text to the law of 29th July 1939. Okay, so summer of 1939, you think about the date. This is right before what becomes World War II, at least in Europe, is about to happen. Of course, it's already started elsewhere, which targeted, again, social plagues and sought to, quote, increase the repression of vice, end quote, in order to highlight the crucial importance of context. He said in 1939, context was absolutely crucial. Again in 1960, context was absolutely crucial. The 1960 law, as Roditi noted, quote, came about at the very moment when, paradoxically, we promised to extend the quality of completely French to some 10 million North African Muslims, whose sexual behavior is not always identical to that which our own Judeo-Christian tradition imposes, end quote. Roditi was struck by how extraordinary it was that an assertively secular, they call it laïque in France, laïque republic felt the need to, quote, reassert in legislative texts concerned with sexual crimes, moral principles and penalties that are only valid in one religious context. He called this the Judeo-Christian context, end quote. Historically, Republican legislators, French legislators, had been quite hesitant to vote laws that appeared to rely only on Christian morality or religious arguments, for reasons anchored in the French Revolution and the long struggle to impose the secular republic over organized Catholic, notably Catholic Church resistance. Roditi's powerful analysis of the tensions that underwrote the 1960 anti-homosexual laws has wider implications, for it draws attention to how in France, the Algerian Revolution catalyzed concerns about sexuality and sexual behavior, fears about female sexuality as well as male, which had institutional effects. So it's worth briefly noting here, of course, that the post-45 period throughout the West, notably in this country, you had dramatic effects in dramatically increasing repression around sexual abnormality, so-called, right? So I think most people know, for example, in this country, so-called McCarthyism actually chased out and targeted far more people for homosexuality than for communism, et cetera. So one of the things we're seeing here is a slightly different chronology. Okay, this is happening in France, this kind of tightening, which begins in 1945, 1946, when de Gaulle decides to keep a set of repressive laws that Vichy had passed that targeted homosexuals, notably male homosexuals, and this new law, again in 1960, so a kind of a somewhat different chronology, but still something that shares part of this wider Western crackdown that is preceding, of course, what we now think of as the sexual revolution, or people did at the time. Post-independence, post-1962, talk of sex and desire was particularly useful in France to think about ongoing relationships, particularly those it had been easy to assume decolonization had foreclosed. Internationally, links between Algeria and France seemed to grow more important rather than less after '62. In France itself, interactions between the French and growing numbers of North African immigrants took on greater prominence. In this context, innumerable commentators turned to sexual examples to evoke, assess, or castigate such connections. Why were there still connections when independence was supposed to be about separation? There's, of course, nothing exceptional, surely, about the popularity of erotic references, terms, and metaphors at this historical metaphor. As historian Dagmar Herzog has noted so incisively, quote, "It's not least because sex is complicated that human beings are so politically and socially manipulable in this area," end quote. What does require investigation is how this coincided with, and I'm arguing here, shaped the emerging sexual revolution. So I'm going to turn now to one of the debates that spanned the 1970s that took on particular intensity in the late 1970s, at least in what we know historically, and that is discussions about rape. And I think hopefully we'll work out some of the ways that this larger debate also happens and it kind of follows through in a whole set of discussions that I focus on in other chapters, other parts of the book. Because over the course of the 1970s, references to Arab men and Algeria, and North Africa more broadly, again, it constantly kind of got brought back to Algeria. So again, this Arab point is one that's also, we could talk about in terms of the Maghreb, but there's almost always a kind of pull of Algeria, and I think there's solid historical reasons for that. Colonial violence was also part of the discussion, and anti-Maghrebi racism. All of these references then played a substantial role in the development of the French discourse, the French discussion of rape and its political, theoretical, and even penal implications. These were particularly visible in the many efforts in this discussion to parse out the respective roles of sex and violence or domination. With some critics denying that there was anything but violence in discussions of rape, while others insisted, some actually insisted there was only really sex, others insisted that sex needed to be thought together with violence, and insisted at least that the sexual aspects truly mattered. In large part because of such debates, rape proved ripe terrain for broader efforts to rethink how power in general functions. Such rethinking was particularly intense because the term rape continued to be widely and insistently deployed as metaphor, even as feminist activists and theorists worked to focus attention on acts of rape themselves, on how they shaped lived reality, destroyed or at least deeply affected individual lives. The Algerian history that shaped French feminist efforts to force the end of silence around rape emphatically conjoined questions of domestic racism and colonial violence. And the intersection was particularly fraught because of the very stark distinctions that so many French political analysts, commentators, and just everyday people wanted to hold on to. Okay? The idea that there were stark distinctions between anti-colonial struggles, which established new boundaries, questions of sovereignty, questions of differences, and efforts to overcome racism, which maneuvered between reassertions of universalism, notably French Republican universalism, and fraternity, and newly pressing summons by certain left-wing activists over the course of the 1970s to recognize what they called the right to be different. Everyone did not have to be thought of as the same and wholly not just about equal, but sameness, that this needed to be rethought. In these years, many French feminists made intense and creative efforts to think their own concerns, their own political demands, in relationship to the Algerian question. Notably, their analyses and tactics first drew from the repertoire of anti-racist and anti-colonialist struggles, and then synthesized elements of the two, looking both to anti-racism, in particular struggles around mainly North African immigration in the early 1970s, which were a key site of political inspiration and hope for many people, or at least concern, as well as the Algerian Revolution itself, the fight for national independence. They sought to fight, they had no choice. This is one of the things I write. They sought to fight rape, to target men who committed rape, and to fight against existing social structures, laws, for example, that, many feminists argued, in refusing to take rape seriously, put all women and all society in danger. At each step, these efforts by feminists encountered the specter of the Arab man. In the early 1970s, assessments of rape in France, for example, invocations of the Algerian War appeared frequently to explain why rape was happening now. Quote, among the crimes that took place during the Algerian War, end quote, one journalist wrote in the semi-pornographic magazine Union. Quote, we learned of many victims who were first raped, then butchered by their aggressors. This demonstrates clearly that rape is just one sign among others of an aggressivity that gives free rein to the instincts, which normally education and the fear of repression held back, end quote. Such arguments emerged directly from claims made by certain French left-wing militants during the Algerian War, activists who were in opposition to the systematic use of torture by French forces against Algerians. These activists had warned that the use of torture, of extreme violence by French troops, notably the use of rape as a weapon, would what they call gangrenize the French. Henri Alleg, most notably in his The Question, which came out in the late 1950s, was immediately banned, a recounting of his own suffering instead of weeks of torture at the hands of French forces in Algeria for pro-French, pro-FLN activity, described the torture chamber as, quote, a school in perversion for young French men, end quote. Such accounts, like his, both focused on how French atrocities victimized their French perpetrators, turning them, it hurt them, and warned French readers of the dangers that these men would return to the metropole, return to the continent, and rape and terrify French women, French children, French people. It was to protect France from this gangrene that it was necessary to stop the rape, torture, and mass killing of Algerians, rather than merely because shared humanity, laws, morals, etc. This critique continued to shape certain left-wing arguments into the 1970s. A far more substantial 1970s discussion identified accusations that North African men, notably Algerians, were rapists or sexual criminals as the most emblematic form of contemporary French racism. Okay? Over the course of the decade, numerous people, notably of Maghrebi descent, described different versions of the accusation. This is from Les Ambassadeurs Necessitaires, a 1974 film. Quote, "They rape our women," was how Qatari presented it in his 1975 film. And he presents it, this director, as words uttered by a racist old man. Feminist writer Leila Sabar included several instances of false accusations against North African men in her 1978 study of sexual violence against women, We Killed Little Girls. As she remarked about one such story, quote, "The scenario was ready-made." She recounted that she had been raped, and in her description of the rapist, repeated the racist stereotypes that always recur when North Africans are suspected in a rape case, end quote. More metaphorically, the climax of Algerian Francophone novelist Rachid Boujedra's third book, An Ideal Topography for a Stereotypical Murder, this is his first book actually set in France itself, reads as a rape. A murderous assault on the Algerian main character. So this is an Algerian man who's immigrating to France. It takes him a long time to get there. He kind of forgets his name, or at least doesn't tell us his name. And then he spends almost a whole day wandering the subways of Paris, trying to get outside. Okay? And when he finally does, he's murdered. A murderous assault as he leaves and goes into the city in darkness. The attack is described as a violent penetration of the body by a band of vicious, notably the word is used, white French men, who are little more than animals, driven by lust and rage. The police who investigate this murder, Boujeda tells us, of course, try to find evidence that the Algerian has been killed because he tried to rape a French woman. The density and specificity of claims in the late 1960s and across the 1970s that North African men were a danger to French women and girls are quite impressive. A constant on the far right, I think I have, so this is, I'm not going to read it, but it says, this guy's name is Mohamed El Prik, is more or less the translation here. He was born in Algeria, but living in France. He's dangerous, kill, rape, steal, etc. You don't have to look very far. There's 700,000 of them like him. So this is a poster that comes out in a French far-right magazine in the mid-1960s, and it gets reused multiple times across the 1970s. Okay? But they also find these accusations of violence and rape into multiple and other published forms as well. In 1968, for example, a cheeky guide to the, quote, naughty sights of Paris, owed to those mesdames and mademoiselles who feel within themselves any inclination to experience some intense emotions, go get yourself raped in the Goutte d'Or, which is an immigrant neighborhood of Paris. Quote, each night you will find there a sufficient number of Mediterraneans, always ready to subject you to the worst degradations, end quote. A study, it's actually a doctoral thesis, of evocations of immigrants in the French regional press over the course of 1978 makes a convincing case that accusations of sexual violence held an outsized role in expanding press and political debates about the presence of Algerian immigrants in France. Pierre Ségeret, who's a sociologist, rejects broader claims by leftist critics who blamed the press for exaggerating immigrant criminality. Okay. A statistical examination of the 5 largest regional newspapers in France over the course of 1978, he argues, shows that coverage of immigrant criminality was actually underreported. The percentage of crime-related articles that mentioned immigrants or gave any kind of signal that immigrants were involved was less, by his calculations, than the percentage of immigrants among prisoners or even among the general population. This was the case in every category of crime but one. Immigrants, overwhelmingly North African immigrants, were blamed in 38% of stories about sexual violence and rape. This was more than 2 times any statistical measure. His statistics dramatized an analysis that echoed in virtually every government inquest into the question. Okay, so I won't go into this, but the police are endlessly investigating these claims that North Africans are heavily criminal, and in particular questions of sexual violence, and they constantly come up with clear proof that it's just not true. We could talk about that. This context then helps explain the sharp focus among left-wing critics on how accusations of rape and sexual violence anchored current anti-Maghrebi racism in France. In 1975, for example, a one-off satirical newspaper, Le Parisien Déchaîné, aimed to expose the demagoguery and racism of the mainstream press. This is its point, right? To illustrate its critique, it placed, quote, "yet another young woman raped by an Arab" as its main headline. So it's kind of mocking, it's a mock-up of a newspaper, and this is what it uses to prove this is how the press acts. This is the type of demagoguery that they're involved in. Leftists and left-leaning media, activists, and mainstream journalists increasingly raised red flags about what they saw as a particularly vicious and hurtful form of sexualized racism, which fabricated fear and hatred of North Africans, further isolated immigrant workers from the general population, and contributed directly to the intense form of sexual misery from which so many suffered. And this was their analysis, at least. This idea of sexual misery really takes hold in the late 60s and 70s, and it's particularly used to describe the living conditions of young people more broadly, why they need sexual liberation, but immigrant men in particular. The same claim of sexual objectification of Algerian men emerged in a confidential 1976 study the French Prime Minister's Office commissioned on French attitudes towards immigrants, following the claim that, quote, "the immigrant plays the role of a screen on which fear is projected, but also desires," end quote. The summary of lessons learned explains that, quote, "the foreigner who accosts a European woman incites sexual desires in her, presenting her with the image of a desirable woman that she rejects, an attitude that she then transforms into disgust for him," end quote. Precisely because these truths were unspeakable, such analyses suggested, and this confidential report to the Prime Minister's Office did exactly this, false accusations against these men effectively worked to obfuscate racist French violence, including, the report noted, discussions of rape and massive violence against women and children during the Algerian War. The use of rape as metaphor, again, is hardly surprising, given the long history of its deployment in relation to imperialism as well as other forms of domination. In 1974, for example, a woman doing sexual education work among female North African women in Paris worried, quote, "wasn't I about to commit the well-known rape of personality for which colonialism so often has been criticized?" End quote. One important pattern in these histories can be seen in the years following the 1945 overthrow of Hitler's regime, which saw German women raped on a mass scale by invading troops. As historian Elizabeth Heinemann recounts, quote, "discussions of women's rapes became taboo a few years after the end of the war," end quote. This silencing, she notes, happened even as, quote, "references to rape permeated the culture," end quote. The historian analyzes how they, quote, "ceased to be references to rapes of women and instead turned into allusions of the rape of Germany," end quote, whether by Soviet-inspired communists or US-inspired consumer culture. Okay, so actual rapes transformed into metaphor. What is remarkable then is that in the mid-1970s in France, because of feminist activism, something different happened. The insistent use of rape as metaphor to describe anti-Maghrebi racism, notably its intense sexual charge, encountered the feminist-driven emergence of a public discussion about rape as sexual violence. Violence suffered mainly by women and inflicted by men. So there's an important discussion that emerges in 1973 and it gets shut down. And I'll talk about it a little bit more. It involves a woman named Mai. It comes out in the pages of the left-wing press, and it immediately is shut down by critics who say, "why are immigrants involved in this rape story? You're feeding the fires of racism." So there's an attempt by feminists in 1970, first of all, again in 1973, but it really breaks out as a topic and an issue around 1976, 1977. And feminists had a difficult time negotiating these questions. What made it difficult, in part, was that the MLF, as it was called, the Mouvement de Libération des Femmes, itself, that is the women's liberation movement in France, MLF, began with such tight links to the far left. As feminist scholars have described, members of this feminist movement came together around the fight for abortion rights, and then they kind of branched out to a whole set of other issues, among them sexual violence. But they largely came from various radical, usually Marxist or anarchist groups, rather than from pre-existing reformist feminist organizations. So there'd been long-standing feminist organizations. The feminists who made up this new, more radical movement didn't come from it. They overwhelmingly came from the far right. Particularly important for the anti-rape campaigns was that they shared with this red and black constellation a post-54 reliance on Algerian references to make claims, as well as to speak to each other. Perhaps nothing captures the Algerian heritage of 70s French feminists better than the resounding ululations, you, that encompassed any number of their demonstrations. In the midst of one of her earliest films, the radical activist and documentary filmmaker Carol Roussopoulos offers a sweeping shot of a Paris demonstration for abortion rights, with the rhythmic sound of you in the sonic background. It was an ululating cry that in France, since at least the 1830s, and the conquest, summoned images of Algeria, of Algerian women, Berber, Arab, or Jewish, defiant, happy, or in mourning. One participant in the March 8, 1978 march to celebrate International Women's Day gave a more specific description. We sing, we scream, we shower the cops who blocked us with our painstakingly hysterical you, which most certainly raised for some of them hurtful memories of Algeria, end quote. She's referencing the war. This summons became so associated with feminist activism on the far left that by the late 1970s, the leftist newspaper Libération regularly used you as the general rubric for any article that had to do with French feminists. Algerian references were hardly limited to symbolic or sonic appeals. In her 1976 film, Lip 5, Monique et Christiane, I don't think I have that here. There's the quote that I read. Carol Roussopoulos focused her camera on a woman she had placed at the heart of a number of the 6 films she made about the striking workers of the Lip watch company in Besançon. The 76 film followed Monique's transformation into an avowed feminist. In earlier films, there were 4 others, she had recognized that women were treated unfairly in the workplace. Now she campaigned to explain to other workers the importance of this insight. To do so, she told the camera, quote, I was going to show the clip, but I think I'll skip it. Quote, I will replace the word man with the word white, and the word woman with the word Arab, end quote. The magic formula would make clear to others that what she wanted to say about woman was, quote, so that each time I say the word Arab, it should be taken to mean women. It was allow people to see how oppression functioned, end quote. In early 74, the writer and activist May published, quote, such an ordinary rape, such daily imperialism. In it, she spoke, and it appeared in there was a famous special issue of the Temps Moderne, edited by Simone de Beauvoir, the feminist philosopher, called Les Femmes sans tête, which reintroduced feminist debates and discussions into the mid-1970s discussion in France. In it, May spoke of a 1973 rape, the rape that left-wing discussions, left-wing media, particularly Libération itself, had made briefly a cause célèbre. This was it kind of came out into the pages of various newspapers, and then the discussion got shut down. Okay? The rape, she explained, had been her rape. May quickly established that the man she'd accused of rape was not, as all of the discussions in the press had suggested, an immigrant worker. He was quote, he was part of the committee of supporters for a kind of struggle for undocumented workers that she was part of too. So outside of the hostel, just like me, quote, end quote, even if this was how most of the letters and even most of the articles defined him, and interesting as I show in the book, like actually even though, as we'll see, he was of African origin and she was of Vietnamese origin, most of the letters to the editor described both as Algerians. Both, however, were of color. Quote, he comes from a country that they were not immigrants, either of them, but they both were of color. Quote, he comes from a country that is a French colony, Martinican or Guadeloupean, and I am of Vietnamese origin, living in France, end quote. Rather than racialized differences, however, she highlighted their mutual relation to French imperialism. Quote, "We each have lived under the foreign control of our home country, and we both have suffered from colonialism," end quote. Her analysis of what had happened between them describes his repeated verbal efforts to overcome her rejection of him, which she linked to the typical Marxist revolutionary. She quoted, quote, the chorus of one of the first songs that someone in the movement for women's liberation wrote that parodied men with, quote, "Don't get worked up about it, babe. Come the revolution, you'll be paid back in spades," end quote. Her argument to him, in turn, without rejecting class altogether, insisted that anti-imperialism revealed more. I began to counter his viewpoint on the situation of women and his seducer's attitude, judging it imperialist. As she saw it, quote, "He pushed me to belong to him, even though I didn't want to, just like an imperialist aggressor does with a foreign country he wants to possess," end quote. As she argued with him, quote, "I laid out the parallels between the oppression that women suffered and that to which colonized people were subjected," end quote. Striking on many levels, I have found few direct references to it in 1974 or since. Its careful avoidance of race and racism, it seems, in preference to talk of class and empire instead, failed to resonate at the time, as did its focus on rape. But in 1976, and then more so in 1977 and 1978, feminists did achieve great success. And the particular tool that they used was an approach called the show trial. And they'd used this successfully to get abortion liberalized. It was to make use of trials to draw public attention. And the person that pioneered this was a woman named Gisèle Halimi. You can see her here. Gisèle Halimi, you saw her earlier too, because she co-wrote with Simone de Beauvoir the book on Jamila Boupacha. Gisèle Halimi had come to public attention during the Algerian War as one of the group of lawyers, Jacques Vergès was another, who worked closely to defend accused FLN activists from the French prison and military system. So she had first grown to prominence then, and then she founded this new organization, Choisir la cause des femmes, and she really, when she entered into it, really completely altered the discussion. The Arab question, however, had come into the middle of this all, because constantly then, as it happened in 1973, these feminist efforts to bring cases to court, and in particular their strategy was to shift the level of court, to move it from the appeals court to the assize court, that is to try to change it from a misdemeanor into making it really be pursued as a crime, criminality. So this attention on the question of courts that was linked to the question of repression drew enormous criticism from the rest of the left, from the far left, from sexual liberationists, but also from others who were very critical of the idea that you would turn to the state to impose repression. So feminists were constantly being described, being forced to respond to this. And so quickly, feminists sought to kind of respond in some ways in dismissive ways. For example, a woman carrying a sign outside of one courthouse saying, quote, "Sexual misery alone does not explain rape." One feminist lawyer explained on television that immigrants, quote, "Immigrants haunted by sexual misery are not what our cases are about. In the sum total of my cases, I have only one Moroccan, and he was born in Tours, born in France." A few months later, an activist complained about the constant deployment of the immigrant worker. He's the one they always point to in order to back up the sexual misery argument. Many feminists, however, particularly those involved in anti-rape activism, were really concerned about this connection. So, for example, in one rape trial where an Egyptian student was accused of raping a young woman who herself was a feminist activist named Brigitte, he too, it's worth pointing out, was constantly described in the press as Algerian, although he's and even an immigrant worker, although he was an Egyptian. Feminist lawyers tried to get him released from prison in awaiting trial. They insisted that as feminists, we cannot accept the type of repression that is being involved here. The judge, it's worth pointing out, and this happened repeatedly, rejected their request, while they repeatedly accepted efforts to shift the site of the site of the trial from a misdemeanor trial to a criminal trial, from correctional to assize. They rejected efforts by feminist lawyers to alter the way that they acted in terms of repression. So, once again, it's Gisèle Halimi who enters into this discussion and really puts things, not into perspective, I think, but shows how difficult it was and how feminists struggled to respond to this. Okay? She spoke in the 1977, September 1977, she gave the final talk at one of the first rape trials where she appeared. Okay? And it got enormous public attention. She began with an effort to force the audience to recognize that rapists as a group, quote, are young men who are no more psychopathic than the majority of young men. They are married, divorced, they have children, they work, they They are unemployed, average, have banal lives. According to her statement, there was only one other thing most rapists were not. They were not psychopaths. They were not, she said, they are not immigrants, end quote. Yet the heart of her argument was more specific. She drew specific parallels to the trial of Jamil Abu Pasha. Trial of Jamil, where the victim had been the accused. She reminded the audience that, quote, I have encountered other rapists. It was 17 years ago. They were blonde. They were parachutists. The Claudine, the woman who'd been raped in this case, that I defended then, Jamil Abu Pasha, was a virgin. She was Muslim. They subjected her to torture, then raped her. That time they used a bottle, end quote. The description evoked the horrors of French repression in Algeria, but in order to insist on the damage rape did and how common it had been for so long, not in order to identify a cause of current rapes in France. More broadly, she used this history to anchor an analysis of the larger dangers of rape. Unlike May, who in '74 had used histories of French colonialism in Vietnam, the Antilles, as well as Algeria, to describe rape as daily imperialism, Halimi argued that, quote, rape is just ordinary fascism. It's everyday fascism, end quote. Imperialism and colonial violence, this hero of French anti-colonialism argued, did not have specific lessons to teach feminists. Feminism, however, did have crucial lessons to teach anyone committed to justice and anti-colonialism. When we, quote, when we accept rape's existence, we've prepared ourselves for fascism more generally. When we accept the whip for women, we accept the cudgel can be applied to any oppressed peoples, end quote. This argument, I want to suggest, is indicative of a growing exhaustion among feminists about what particular lessons could be learned from Algerian and other French colonial histories. It did not mean the disappearance of concerns about either anti-Arab racism or about the risks of a repressive strategy in the fight against rape. Halimi would often discuss, we need to do something else, we need to change the way that punishment is meted out. But by the end of the 1970s, most on the left, like these feminists, had become too wary of evoking Arab men as models, too concerned about what references to immigration, to Arabs, to the Algerian Revolution, to Algerians in France might apply. At the same time, it's worth pointing out, the far right continued to talk about sex and Arabs to advance their agenda. What disappeared around the end of the 70s, that is, was an intense conflict between certain French people about different ways that connections between Arabs, quote, and sex could be understood, between those who argued that in what made them different, these Arabs offered solution to a variety of French problems, and others who argued that they were emblematic of all the problems that Arabs continued to wreak on France and the French. The first has faded, perhaps justifiably so. The second, much evidence suggests, has become ever more influential. Thanks a lot.
I think we have time for, about 10 minutes of questions, Jason? Hello, right? 10. And we have a microphone or two, so people who want to ask questions, please wait for the microphone and identify yourself.
Hi, thank you for that talk. Wow, mic is booming a bit. My name is Zakiya Iman Jackson. I'm an assistant professor of English and gender studies at George Mason. So I had a question for you. I'm still formulating it, but I didn't want to miss my chance. I'm wondering if you can widen the relational frame a bit. So you're talking about this dyad between the constructed nature of Arab sexuality vis-a-vis kind of white Frenchness, and I'm wondering about a larger relational frame. So you're bringing in someone like Said, someone like Fanon, Vietnam, and I'm wondering about French imperialism more generally. So how does the Antillean, how does the aspects of French Empire in West Africa, what is that larger racial frame for producing these narratives about Arabs as, per a lot of narratives about race, sexualized race, of being either excessive or lacking, right? So what is the larger kind of racial story that we can say that can make us, that can illuminate this kind of dyad between Arabness and white Frenchness, particularly, I'm thinking about Arabness, particularly in relationship to Africa writ large, and the construction of African sexuality more generally in France as well. So I was hoping you can elaborate on that. Thank you so much.
Sure. Well, how would I say this? The claim of the book and the claim of the argument is that there's something more specific, that talking just about racialized issues or about and the long history. I mean, this is, again, for those of you who've done any research on these topics, like racism and Orientalism more broadly, there's a lot of repetition. Okay, there's a lot of repetition. So what I'm really struck by, and this is why the book begins and ends between 1962 and 1979, is some of the particularities. And one of the notable particularities is an attention to men. Okay, in a discussion that, as I signaled with my reference to things about harems and veils in terms of Arab or the East, the Orient so-called, has tended to be the primary focus of these debates on sexual. And I think one of the ways perhaps to give us some chronological density to our discussions and some form of specificity, here I'm suggesting that it's in this period for a variety of reasons. It's both around men and masculinity, not so much, in fact we see really infrequently discussions of Arab women, North African women, also relatively infrequent discussions of Islam per se. And so this is one of the reasons, 79, of course, the Iranian Revolution, the displacement of the Arab by the Muslim, a return to the center, discussions of the veil and of women that accompany that, I think help give some chronological specificity. Even more than that, besides the focus on men, there's a particular attention to North Africa, the Maghreb, and even more so to Algeria. Okay, the Arab tends to be the reference, and the reference has multiple valences. It's not just a denial of the kind of real ethnic and other complexity of North Africa or the Arab world in general, right, by insisting that they're all Arabs. There is, in the early 1970s, in particular on the far left, an insistent attention to the Arab Revolution as a larger phenomena. The Palestinian struggle has re-brought to the fore the importance of the Algerian struggle, the Saharan struggle, debates within Algeria, even though there's deceptions, etc. So a whole set of beliefs that the Arab world has something, that an Arab revolution is on the march. But even more specifically, and this is what I am really struck by in my sources, is how these discussions constantly narrow it in and say it's really not even about the Moroccans. People like the Moroccans. Tunisia, it's really about Algerians. So for example, one of the things I talk about is there's this idea of the limit of tolerance, the threshold of tolerance. And there's this supposedly social scientific premise that's all about outsiders, like, autotones, you have to deal with outsiders, and outsiders produce this reaction as soon as you go over a certain percentage. This is the threshold. And in the internal discussions, they're all saying, well, it really only works for Maghrebis, it really only works for Algerians. So that there is a real specificity. But even in these two moments that I mentioned here, the Egyptian student, he's an Egyptian student, right? He's there on a scholar. I mean, his parents have paid for him to be there. He's not an immigrant worker. He's not Maghrebi. The press primarily identifies him as an Algerian worker. In this debate about May's rape, a woman, again, of Vietnamese origin, raped, she claims, by a man from the Antilles, of African origin. All of the letters, and in fact the newspaper's own discussion, headed by Jean-Paul Sartre, it's worth pointing out, all focus on Algeria. Okay, so I'm trying, without deny, I think this fits into a larger discussion, but it's particularly intense and really relatively focused. And I think it becomes broader again after 1979. And again, I think it has something specifically to do with the intensity of the way that the Algerian Revolution served as a model for not just the Algerian Revolution, but again, even more so, another model for people looking for something beyond the kind of decadent Western working class was the immigrant worker struggle in 1970s France. So that Algerians kind of fit this double role of heirs to revolution, incarnation of actual revolutionary potential today, right? So there's that particular role, I think, really, that's what I've honed in on, but I think it's evocative, and I'd love to see more work done on other stuff, but that's where I'm going to go with my responses. Okay.
One more question? Another one? Yes.
Okay.
Perhaps a related question, but, sorry, I'm Alex McCartney. I'm a PhD student in history at Georgetown. I'm curious, so much of the international and anti-imperialism in part of the period that you're talking about is so much focused on the Vietnam War, both in Europe, the United States, and in Japan, and as many scholars have pointed out, in the French May, the importance of Vietnam, certainly in terms of images of heroic masculinity in
Right.
Che and Black Panthers and all these other sort of revolutionary discourse. I'm curious, what effect does the war have, that particular war, especially as a former French colony, have on this sort of discourse? Interesting you discuss this Vietnamese woman
Right.
as an Algerian, but that sort of anti-imperialism that's traded across borders so frequently, does that color what's going on in terms of how the Algerian War is looked upon in terms of Algerian men and even into that?
Right, so I'll briefly, hopefully respond in two different ways. One is the sexualization aspect. There are specifically sexualized valences around which particular groups are identified. So there's a particular set of discussions, but they're really, really infrequent about Indo-Chinese, as the French would call them, or in particular Vietnamese immigrants in France that resonate with those discussions. Just as there are discussions of African men, of like sub-Saharan African or black men and black women for that matter, in France, they really pale in comparison to the discussions we see around North Africans, Maghrebis, what are often called Arabs in the discussion. And in particular, then, one of the things that I'm interested in is how the far left, which is what I've more focused on today, in France was really attentive to how much more effective references to the Arab Revolution were than the Vietnamese Revolution. Not in mobilizing bourgeois students, as they would call them, but in kind of maybe getting them access to working class, by which they meant immigrant populations. So the Goutte d'Or neighborhood, for example, which is still the center of North African immigration in France, was described as, for example, we marched through the streets with the Palestinian, Algerian, and National Liberation Front flags, leading people to demand justice in Palestine, but also explain to them afterwards how much the current situation in France resembled the larger situation that demanded revolution across the world. So they saw in the kind of, if you think about Herbert Marcuse, One-Dimensional Man, kind of certainties that the Western working class is too exhausted, it has been bought off by consumerism and has no more revolutionary potential. The North African immigrant population appeared particularly useful, so that even though they were very, very attentive to questions of Vietnam and American imperialism writ large, the particular attractiveness in a French context, of course, of this defeat of France, it's a defeat of capitalism and imperialism more broadly, of course, but it seems particularly compelling because it succeeded in destroying the French government, or at least destroying the French government's efforts to hold on to them and changing the French regime, it's worth pointing out. And at the same time, it seemed particularly attentive to drawing those people that might actually help them do some actual political work, so North African immigrants. So those are the main reasons why I think you see a lot more around this discussion than the Vietnam discussion. Great. Thanks a lot.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.